Michelle? Have we done the cell phone message? Cell phone? 2 volts? No. Hi everybody, hope you have a really great day at the seminar today. It's going to be a good one. Please make sure your cell phone's turned off. And remember, we are looking for your questions from the live audience. So when the questions from the live audience come, we'll bring the microphone up here and you need girls. Can you just move down and fill up the gaps, please? That, can you fill in these gaps? And in fact, can we have, why don't we have 1, 2, 3, and girls, if you come in over here, don't go right to the end there. Can you come in, the girl in the pink, sorry, I don't know your name, come across here. 1, 2, 3. There we go, fantastic. We have got a whole lot of seniors and as they come, fantastic. You guys sit over there, and then you guys 1, 2, 3. Okay? Okay, people, it's 1 minute till we go live, so if you can get your Kia ora and good afternoon, and welcome to the final seminar of the LENScience Senior Biology Seminar Series 2010. My name is Michael Denny and I'm joined today by Dr. Alan Beadle, Dr. Tatiana Bukliach, sorry, I apologise, Bukliach, and Professor Sir Peter Gluckman. And we're looking today at human evolution, a particularly appropriate topic to finish the seminar series off with, as after all, it's all about us. Before we get into that, let's do a quick look back at the last seminar and the student who gets the award for the best contribution to the wiki. As always, it's very difficult to make that decision, but this time we've decided to go with the student who has won the award previously. But the answer the student gave to the final challenge question is actually a very good example of the sort of quality of answer that is expected in scholarship. So well done to Ali from Horowhenua College. You've done it again, and if you haven't seen her answer, please do go and have a look at it. It shows exactly what we're looking for in a scholarship answer, the ability to take the biological concepts that you've been learning, apply them to the context of the question, and most importantly, do it in a way that is integrated, coherent, and logical. So a good example of what we are looking for. So human evolution. As a topic, there are many of the concepts that you've learnt this year in Year 13 biology are underpinning the study of human evolution. And probably the most important of these concepts is the idea of natural selection. As we go through the seminar today, what I would like you to be doing is thinking about how the variation that existed in the populations of our ancestors has been acted on by selection of pressures arising from different environmental conditions, and that altogether this process has resulted in what we are here in 2010. As well as that, we're also going to be touching on the idea of speciation, the formation of new species, and also adaptive radiation, as I will show you very shortly. Let's go the right way. Now, I don't know how many of you realise it, but it's actually 6 weeks today until the New Zealand scholarship scholarship exam for biology. So we're hitting the key time. By this point in time, those of you who are doing scholarship, this statement should be becoming very familiar to you, and that you know what those three key words that are underlined and highlighted in blue, what they mean and what is expected of you when you are writing your answer. For those of you not doing scholarship, well, you've got just over a month until the NCA Level 3 biology exam. And the human evolution stuff that we're going to be looking at today links in with the achievement standard on processes and patterns of evolution, and also on trends in human evolution. Human evolution, what is it that we're going to be focusing on? We're going to look today at two key events, the development of bipedalism and the development of our brain, and look at how they together contributed to the evolution of modern Homo sapiens, and also the impact that they have had on our cultural evolution, our life history, and then finally we're going to finish off with a look at how an understanding of our evolutionary history can help us to appreciate some of the things that afflict us today. Before we get into it, let's do just some quick revision. As you're all aware, we belong to a group called the hominoids, and that group's made up of us and the great apes. We further subdivide this into the two groups, the great apes and what we call the hominins. And the hominins includes us, plus all our now extinct ancestors. Let's look more closely at the evolution of the hominins. You'll be familiar with diagrams like this, and we'll have seen different variations of it. But what I want to point out to you here is the idea of adaptive radiation, because human evolutionary history illustrates adaptive radiation very well. And you'll remember that adaptive radiation is the rapid formation of new species to occupy available ecological niches. The first radiation took place with the early bipedal hominins and includes the Australopithecines, and that's shown by the blue triangle on this diagram. The second radiation was a side event involving the genus Paranthropus, and it's a good example of what we mean by taking advantage of available ecological niches. The Paranthropus genus became specialised for eating a diet consisting of nuts, root tubers and seeds. And because of that, they needed certain adaptations, particularly to do with the jaw and teeth. And so they're actually characterised by a skull with very heavy jaws and very large teeth. The third radiation, shown with the pink triangle, is that of our genus, genus Homo. And it's associated with the development of the large brain, the dispersal of hominins into new areas, particularly out of Africa. The final radiation isn't associated so much with dispersal, but with the further movement of anatomically modern humans throughout the world. Now look very closely at this diagram and the two species that I've circled. Those of you who have watched Lisa Matasu-Smith's seminar on Pacific migration will know that this year some research has been published into the genome of the Neanderthals using ancient DNA, and that contrary to what was thought for a very long time, it is possible that there was interbreeding between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals. And you'll be very aware that the definition of a species is that not capable of interbreeding. So this research is starting to possibly question the classification of these two as different species, but it's still very much early days yet. But it's another good example of how science and scientific understanding is not a fixed body of knowledge. It's always open to reinterpretation in the light of new evidence. And Tatiana is actually going to give another example of that a little bit later on when she talks about her section of the seminar. So before we go into actually looking at bipedalism in the brain, Sir Peter Gluckman is actually going to do a bit of revision with us over what exactly is evolution. Now, unfortunately, Sir Peter wasn't able to be with us today, but he was able to record this segment for us before he left to go overseas. So I'll hand over to Sir Peter.
Hello, I'm Peter Gluckman. I'm the director of the Centre for Human Evolution, Adaptation and Disease within the Liggins Institute of the University of Auckland. The centre is arguably the largest group of scientists in the world focused on the relationship between evolution, human health, and human disease. Unfortunately, I won't be able to be with you for the bulk of the seminar, and the two other members of the centre, Dr. Beadle and Dr. Buglargis, who are both experts in their own right, will give the bulk of the seminar to you. Before we start on the main part of the seminar, it might be just useful to be sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to understanding what we mean by the term evolution. Evolution covers many different concepts, but at its heart there are two fundamental concepts. Firstly, the relationship between species, and secondly, the way species change over time. 3.5 billion years ago, the first life forms appeared on the planet, and since that time, macroevolutionary processes have seen all the species of plant, animal, and bacteria are in various ways interrelated through their macroevolutionary change from that initial life form. And in many ways, that simple concept of the relationship between species is one of the most important parts of evolutionary science. And what it's allowed us to do, of course, is to make studies of genes in animals like the fruit fly, or in worms like the flatworm like C. elegans, and take that information from these species and be able to interpret it in relationship to human health. So much we understand about human development, for example, comes from studies of fruit fly genes or studies of C. elegans genes. So we should even realise that although we're focusing the seminar on human evolution and its relationship to disease, there's a lot to learn from the other species to whom we've been related across evolutionary time. But the more relevant part of what evolution is the way organisms change over over time. And this happens through the processes of primarily of selection and drift. We won't talk a lot about drift today, but drift is when there is a small population, like the small population of Maoris that would have come by canoe to New Zealand 700, 800 years ago, and therefore there's a limited genetic repertoire within that small population that arrived here, which means that that population may have a different gene pool, if you like, from that of a population which is much larger. And therefore there's a game of chance being played with drift as to what components of the gene pool end up in a population which goes through such a bottleneck, and those populations which don't go through such bottlenecks. But the process which I think all of you will be most familiar with is that of selection. Selection is based on the concept of fitness. What is fitness? Fitness in its narrow sense is simply the concept that an organism's evolutionary success is determined by the number of descendants it leaves on the earth who themselves are able to reproduce. There's a broader definition of fitness which we call inclusive fitness, which means when it's not necessarily your direct descendants, but it is individuals that carry many of your genes that survive successfully into the next generation. So, for example, your nieces or nephews are not your direct descendants, but they, of course, are closely related to you. So there are, in some species, situations where selection operates not just through direct fitness of your offspring, but also through the survival of related people, with related organisms with your genes. The classic examples are the social insects like the bee, where the worker bees themselves do not reproduce, but because they carry genes in common with the larvae within the nest, their support of those larvae is allowing their genes indirectly to be transferred to the next generation. The most common form of selection is, of course, natural selection. Natural selection was discovered independently by Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, and is based on the presence of variation within a population. And in many ways it was a recognition that it's variation which is the driver of evolution, which was the big insight of Darwin in particular. If there is variation which has a genetic component to it, so it can be inherited to some degree or not, then offspring will be born with variable traits. Those traits which make an organism more likely to survive in the environment are therefore selected for, and those traits which make the organism less likely to survive in the environment are selected against, negative selection. And therefore, over evolutionary time, if the environment remains relatively constant, the organisms will come to have a genetic repertoire and a phenotype appropriate and better matched to the environment they are living in by the process of natural selection. You can regard another way of explaining this is to say that the organism has become better adapted to the environment, that evolution has adapted the organism to the environment because it's better matched to the environment. Now this works only if the environment is relatively constant. If the environment then changes, then over time there may be again selective processes at work, or if there's an acute change, then the organism has to rely on its physiological processes to try and adapt or survive in that environment. Now it's important to recognise that that latter use of the word adapt is not the same meaning as adaptation in the evolutionary sense, which is the result of natural selection. There are, of course, other processes of selection that can occur as well. The most important of those is sexual selection, whereby it is not whether the organism survives better in the environment or not that drives the selective process, but in fact it's whether the organism reproduces more better in that environment or not because of sexual selection, either because of mate choice, the female bird choosing the peacock with the longest tail as an example of mate choice, or by male dominance, as in the case of red deer stags, where it's the deer who's got the strongest horns and gets the mating rights in the harem, dominates, and therefore his gene pool is spread to the next generation better. There's one other kind of selection which we shouldn't forget, and that's of course artificial selection. This is not natural evolutionary processes. This is human imposed evolutionary processes. This is how the various breeds of dog have evolved from the wolf over the last perhaps 10,000 years. It's how the different breeds of pigeon that Charles Darwin studied in The Origin of the Species were selected by pigeon fanciers in very few generations. Here, we're not relying on the natural processes of selection, that is whether an animal is better equipped to reproduce and survive in a given environment, but we're relying on the choice of the human agent to either say, I want these features, provided they're genetically determined, to be magnified or not in the population. And of course, not every feature is genetically determined, and therefore they cannot be selected. The classic example of that is the racehorse. The whole racehorse industry is based on luck, for the simple reason that certain attributes of racing, of a racehorse's prowess, cannot be selected for because they're not genetically determined. Most of human medicine is focused on how.
You're right, go ahead.
Okay. Where's the next? Sorry. Oops. No, am I doing it right? Sorry.
You're right.
Yeah, I'm all right.
We got it. I'll do it.
Right. Okay. Right. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about two essential features of being human, and this is the first one that I want to discuss is bipedalism. Bipedalism, next slide, has been considered an essential feature of being human since the beginning of thinking of human evolution in terms of natural selection. So already Charles Darwin in the 1870s, in his book On the Descent of Man, said that it was really walking upright and standing upright once that human limbs were no longer needed, the front limbs needed for things like locomotion and carrying, supporting weight. Then once the front limbs could be used for tools, tasks such as holding tools or weaponry, that this was really the beginning of evolution in the sense of modern human. So obviously, walking upright is much more than efficient locomotion. Next slide. Now, the first member of the hominin group that we know with certainty that walked upright, it was bipedal, was Australopithecus. Was actually a group or genus of hominins called Australopithecus that lived about 4 to 3 million of years ago. And the most famous representative of this group is Australopithecus afarensis species. And you might have heard of Lucy, which is a skeleton of a member of this species that was found in the 1970s. Now, we know about Lucy and Australopithecus afarensis that it was a small hominin, sexually dimorphic, so men and women had sort of different sizes. It was a brain of a relatively small size, just slightly larger than chimpanzees, and which shows you that the evolution of walking upright actually started earlier than the evolution of a large brain. Now, we know for them that they, most of the time, this is what it means being habitual bipedal, that most of the time they walked upright, but not necessarily the whole of the time. And they certainly were not efficient runners, they just walked. Now, by the time the new genus appeared, Homo genus, which was about 2.5 to 2 million years ago, and the locomotion evolved in terms that these new groups of species actually walked upright all of the time, and we know that they were efficient runners. So this is obligatory. Bipedalism means that they basically walked upright and ran all of the time. They were no longer dependent on quadrupedal locomotion at any point. And these are just sort of some other characteristics that characterize this particular species. So you can see that they actually sound quite a lot like Homo sapiens, or the modern species today, and you probably know from your studies before. Now, the big question is really like why, actually before I go, I should say something about what kind of anatomical, next slide, anatomical adjustments were needed to go from the quadrupedal to bipedal locomotion. One adjustment that you probably might have learned about in your studies is the change in the curvature of spine. So this sort of double S that spine has, the cervical and lumbar lordosis is something that was necessary to support the weight and to carry the body in this position. The next one is the move of the foramen magnum, or the hole in the skull that connects the central nervous system, the parts of the brain that are in the skull, where the spinal cord. It moved from quite a sort of posterior or bake position in quadrupedal apes to a central position in humans. Then we have shape of the pelvis that became much broader, wider, and shorter. And then we have, for example, changes in the lower limbs. So femur is significantly longer in humans compared to apes. And also there are changes in the joints, the sort of position and the shape, the knee joint that can lock in. Rather than, as you sort of probably, just by observing quadrupedal animals, they have quite a sort of different shape. It doesn't need this locking in while you're walking moving the other leg. So all of these adjustments actually, while necessary for walking upright, they also incurred costs. And some of the quite obvious costs, and you probably are familiar with, things like back pain. It's just that our spine hasn't evolved quite enough to actually be both efficient for locomotion and sort of carry our weight all of the time. And things like flat feet and varicose veins, where you have sort of also the force of gravity and hydrostatic pressure acting, flat feet, and then changes in the shape of the foot. But there are also some bit more complex adjustments and bit more complex problems that arose from that. And one of them is because of the change in the shape of the pelvis, the shape of the birth canal is quite different, and it actually requires quite a complex move through the canal. And it's which meant that for humans it became impossible to be born at the same level of development as other mammals. So humans are born relatively immature. So when they're born, when you sort of think of little calves, they can walk pretty much straight away. But in case of humans, they have this long period of dependence on their mothers, and they actually learn how to walk a year or a year and a half later. Now, the question is, why did bipedalism evolve? As you can sort of see, there are all these other animals, or even like primates, including apes, that are living perfectly and successfully, and their locomotion is entirely quadrupedal. Now, the theory or sort of hypothesis of the evolution of bipedalism that was valid and accepted pretty much, it was sort of dominant hypothesis in science, is that there was a certain kind of environmental change or shift, that hominins, predecessors of Australopithecines, changed their environmental niches from something that was a continuous forest or woodlands, where it was much more efficient to move by climbing up the trees and jumping from one tree to the other, where you needed to use all four limbs, to an area of open spaces of wooded savanna, where actually it was almost impossible to move that way, and when you actually needed to sort of cover quite large open spaces. So there was sort of, it was a much more effective way of locomotion. Next slide. Sort of the theory was that our predecessor, so predecessor of Australopithecines, actually moved in a certain form of this knuckle walking locomotion that great apes such as this gorilla in picture is using. So actually supporting the weight on the knuckles of his front limbs. And the scientists tried to calculate what is the net cost of this transport for chimpanzees and other for quadrupedal chimpanzees, for apes, chimpanzees that are moving on sort of form of knuckle walking and bipedal, compared to the bipedal locomotion used by humans. And what they could, and this cost of transport was expressed in terms of the expenditure of oxygen per kilogram of body weight. And what they could see that actually the expenditure of oxygen in human locomotion is actually much lower, making it much more efficient. These dotted lines, you can see, they actually show the trend lines in sort of overall bird and mammal species. So as you can see, like human locomotion is extremely efficient, even when you compare it to a kind of more broader mammal and a bird animal world. Yes, so this is all very good, and this is what the story was until October 2009, and then everything changed. Because in October in 2009, Science magazine ran a special issue on a new, well, actually not a newly found species, but a species that was found, specimens of a hominin species that were found in the 1990s in East Africa, and they were analyzed over the period of 15 years. And this species is called Ardipithecus. I think we have it's called the Ardipithecus ramidus. It became quite well known on the internet as Ardi. I guess nobody could pronounce this Ardipithecus ramidus. And while everyone expected them to be a kind of knuckle-walking, ape-like predecessor, it turned out that actually their anatomy was completely different. We can sort of see, for instance, everybody expected them to have quite sort of flexible foot that will allow them to sort of hold onto the branch of the trees. But their foot was actually turned out to be much closer to the foot of old world monkeys, quite rigid. So they could actually easily bounce off the branches of the tree. Yet at the same time, they still had an opposable toe, so they could hold with their toes onto the branches of the tree. There are sort of other aspects of their anatomy were somewhere sort of in between Australopithecines and apes. So for instance, their pelvis, which is on your left side, is, and on the right side you can see the Lucy's pelvis, is sort of wider than the pelvis of apes, but narrower than the Australopithecine pelvis. Then we have their teeth are in the middle, and they're sort of in between homogeneous teeth on the left, and Australopithecines, their canines are a lot smaller. And their hand is sort of quite a flexible hand, with an opposable thumb. Now, all this kind of anatomical information together meant that, for one thing, it seems now that rather than the predecessor of Australopithecus being something that's quite close to apes, it looks like apes, and so that we kind of, sort of say, evolved from something ape-like. It looks like the predecessor, there was a common predecessor to both apes and the hominins. So hominins and apes evolved in parallel. And that is kind of the other thing that's quite relevant to what I'm talking about today, and that's sort of like what was the reason for the development of bipedalism, because the foot of Ardipithecus indicates that these species actually lived in a wooded habitat. So if they didn't live in a kind of open space savanna, what drove them actually to start walking rather than sort of still climbing and sort of bouncing up the branches of the tree? So some alternative explanations came into play. And perhaps you're familiar with some of them, because some of them have been around for quite a long time. One explanation is that there is thermoregulation, because if you sort of stand upright, you're actually exposed to the sun much less than if your whole body is in kind of quadrupedal position. So there's less sort of expenditure on maintaining the normal body temperature. Then there is the idea of predator avoidance, because if you kind of stand upright, you can actually view the whole kind of horizon, and you can sort of view the area around you much better. Then there is the kind of ability to carry things, to weapons or food or whatever. So that's sort of one proposition. And the fourth one is reproductive strategies, and that's the hypothesis that was proposed by the scientists working on RD. And that actually incorporates this carrying ability, because they proposed that it was the ability to carry food and so provide food that made bipedal members of the Ardipithecus ramidis species more attractive as sexual mates to females from that species. So it was a kind of a pressure that drove in sort of sexual selection terms this evolution towards bipedalism. Now, this is still very open. This has only been out and discussed among scientists for a year, and because it's all based on one whole skeleton and pieces from 36 individuals, and it's sort of still kind of, we don't really know in which way the direction the further discussion of this topic will go. So yeah, we'll see. Okay, so with this, I would like to sort of end of bipedalism and move to the other essential characteristic of human evolution, of being human, and this is having a large brain. Primates generally have very large brain compared to other animals, and humans have the largest brain compared to their body size to all primates. You can go to the next. Now, if we look at this interesting graph, we can see that if we look at the brain volume compared to the body weight, in great apes, so this is this green line, and then compare it to these early hominids, Australopithecines, you can see that while their brain is indeed somewhat larger, that actually this increase is not that dramatic. It's sort of, as they become larger, their brain kind of follows the same curve, the same graph. But something happened in the Homo species that actually drive this increase in the evolution of the brain much more rapidly and much more dramatically. So if you look at the sort of, just have a look at the body size of the humans is, you know, it's sort of like somewhere, it's above chimp and it's certainly below gorilla, but it's many times, the size of the brain is many times larger. Now, the question is like, why? Why did humans need a large brain? After all, there were many species in the evolutionary history that actually were very successful, survived for a very long time and had very small brains. So think of dinosaurs. They had really small brains for the size of their body. There are, however, like a whole range of advantages that are arising from the brain development. And the question that sort of was posed is really to try to kind of think of what were the drivers of the evolution of the large brain. And there are really two groups of theories. And we can summarize them. And the first group is the one that really looks at the advantages that a large brain may have to an individual. For instance, a large brain makes the individual sort of more capable of advanced hunting strategies, of, you know, inventing new tools, weapons, things like that can become really useful. And the other sort of group of theories is talking about living in a society. That living in large social groups was actually what drove the evolution of the brain. And this other group of explanation is something that's called the theory of social brain. Social brain theory is something that's, I think, probably the dominant explanation today. And it's usually associated with the name, well, it's actually associated primarily with the name of the British anthropologist Robin Dunbar. Now, Dunbar did this really interesting research in which he tried to look at the sizes of the brain and relate them to the size of the social groups in which different primate species lived. Now, when I say size of the brain, I mean primarily here size of the neocortex. And as you may know, neocortex is really the part of the brain that's responsible for complex functions, such as, say, generating motor commands, interpreting sort of sensory perceptions, conscious thought, emotions, and in humans' language as well. And neocortex exists in all mammals. But if you look at the rat brain, it's actually quite smooth and relatively small compared to the rest of the brain. And so neocortex ratio represents the ratio between the volume of the neocortex and the volume of the rest of the brain. In humans, the neocortex ratio is 4, meaning that basically it's 4 times larger than the rest of the brain. So 80% of the human brain really is, the volume is neocortex. And you can this is why human brain is so wrinkled, and the surface is actually really large. So what Dunbar said, and for instance, chimps that are the first snakes whose neocortex ratio is 3.1, they live in group sizes of around 50 individuals. And he argued that humans whose neocortex ratio is about 4, as the evolution happened, especially in the Homo species, when the brain increased, their social group size was around 150. Now, you may ask, how, this was kind of interpolation, trying to kind of guess based on this way it could be. But he also managed to support these hypotheses with some data that came from various kinds of studies and information. For instance, looking at the size of Neolithic villages, you see the size, then hunter-gatherer societies today, to Roman army units, and even things like social network. This was assessed, I think, on the social networks such as Facebook, where they kind of an average number of contacts. And I know that many of you will have 500 contacts, but I'm talking about in between. It looks like the human function the best or in a sort of this group-sized environment. Now, sort of the next question that we might ask is like, why is sort of the size of the social group really matters to the evolution of the brain? What is it within living in a social group that, well, living in social group is very useful for all animals that live in group, because group can help you get more food, it can protect you from enemies, it can also provide a large selection of mates. At the same time, living in group is sort of quite costly in terms of time, because it requires maintaining human relationship. It requires quite a lot of time and energy, and they can go either way. They can be very good, they can be very bad. And in primates, this maintenance of relationship between individuals is resolved through grooming. So they help each other maintain their appearance, they help each other maintain their cleanliness. You may have seen this in nature history films. Now, it's estimated that primates spend about 20% of their time grooming, so maintaining this social relationship. Now, if humans, and based on this neocortex ratio, size of the group, were spending equal amount of time, then they would be spending about like 50% of their time sort of grooming each other. So now imagine 50% of your time you're sort of applying makeup to your friends and sort of combing their hair or something like that to maintain your friendship. Now, Facebook is, I think, much more effective. And the thing is that the argument is that language made maintaining social relationships a lot more effective, and that it was the development of language that drove the evolution of brain within the group. We know that early language appeared as some form of language about more than 1 million years ago with Homo erectus, that some kind of formal language appeared about probably 500,000 years ago, and then the grammatical language beginnings go about 200,000 years ago. How do we know that? Of course, I mean, there are obviously no written sources from that period. This comes from a combination of anatomical and genetic data. Anatomical data on the basis of skeleton, there is information coming from the shape of the hyoid bone, the grooves and the sort of hypoglossal nerves, nerve that innervates the tongue, and sort of things like that in a vocal apparatus and anatomical. And genetic data are mostly based on a particular gene that's called FOXP2, and mutations of this gene have been shown to be associated with serious dysfunctions in speech and language, and there are families that carry this gene, and that there is a sort of inheritance of this kind of problem. And this gene, the age of this gene has been calculated to go back to correlate with anatomical information. The last thing that I want to end with is to say that another associated driver of the evolution of the social brain is being able to think and sort of interpret the intentions of people around you. Are they friends? Are they foes? What are they thinking? And this is where theory of mind, the kind of idea that comes into play. Theory of mind is sort of explanation that the evolution of the brain, one of the drivers was the need to sort of constantly sort of know what other people are thinking, what are they thinking about you, and so forth. So this intentionality explanation is divided into several levels. So the first level of theory of mind says that I know what I'm thinking, right? And sort of the second level is that I know, or I think I know that what you're thinking. So think you're sort of in your room and you're playing your stereo loud, and your parents are sort of in the other room, and you know what they are thinking about that. Now, the kind of third level is that you also sort of think you know what they think that you're thinking, right? But there's also kind of another level. It says that you know, you think you know about what they are thinking about what you're thinking about them, right? But there's also kind of, you can go even further and sort of say, you know what they are thinking about you thinking about what they will think if you don't respond to what they want you to do. So you can see this kind of gets really complicated in sort of various levels but it's actually something that we are all capable of doing. Adult humans can handle this sort of 5 levels of intentionality without a problem. Small children, by the age of 4 or 5, can handle about 3, and this is when they can begin to lie. Before that, it's not. So can we just go back. So the predictions for ancestral hominid, and it's quite important because some forms of human culture, for instance, religion, would not be possible without having these levels of intentionality, thinking that there is a higher being who is thinking of you, thinking of them, sort of trying to interpret, sort of your wishes. So what we kind of assume also on the basis of the size of the brain that Neanderthals, that modern humans and Neanderthals had this level of adult intentionality of about 4, while all these sort of other ones, as you can see, are just sort of gradually lower on the scale. So as you can see, having a large brain is quite useful, but it is also quite costly in terms of energy expenditure. And my colleague Alan will tell you a little bit about that.
Hello. What I'm going to talk about is some of the consequences of having a large brain, both from some surprising aspects of human physiology and also for the effect it can have on human evolution. I'll show that we can evolve in a particular way called cultural evolution. But first of all, some facts about our large brain. And the numbers are here. The basic take-home message from this is that the brain of a human newborn and an adult chimpanzee are about the same size, which puts a bit of perspective on the human ability for cognition. And looking at growth patterns, the brain of the chimpanzee grows quite quickly before birth and then tails off pretty rapidly after birth, whereas compared with the human, brain growth continues for quite some time after birth, in fact into mid-childhood, about 7 or 8 years. The brain has actually reached its maximum mass, but not its maximum efficiency, as we'll talk about in a bit. In fact, you can see here from these little mannequins that at 22 weeks, about halfway through pregnancy, the human head is pretty big, and that decreases relatively throughout development until adult proportions reached by about 12 years. But brain maturity isn't complete until about 25 years. And how do we know that? Because you can do brain scans to show which bit of the brain light up to when people are presented with problems. And brain maturity isn't complete until about 25 years, which has implications for all sorts of things that you can probably imagine, like driving and drinking and what have you. One consequence of this large brain at birth is the difficult process of birth. And this diagram shows the chimpanzee and human pelvis with the emerging fetal head coming through. On the left, the chimpanzee, you can see that all really pops through quite nicely. But in the human, with the much bigger brain at birth, then things are much more difficult, and the fetus has to twist and turn and rotate to get out. Human babies are fat. Compare the baboon on the left with the chubby girl or boy on the right. And here's another appealing little creature. This is a baby fur seal. And this guy lives in cold waters of the Southern Ocean. You'd expect it to be really fat at birth. But in fact, it's not particularly, about 6 or 7% fat at birth. But look on the left. Next slide, please. And humans are really fat at birth. About 15% of a newborn baby is pure blubber. And it gets worse. That 15% increases to about 25% at the age of 10 months, and then tails off as the child gets more active. Now, why is that? Is baby fat an adaptation? Well, it obviously is, because we've all got it, something evolved. But an adaptation for what? Okay, so let's look at this graph. The percentage of metabolic expenditure devoted to the brain. And you can see at birth, then 80% of the energy that a baby takes in is used by the brain. The brain's very big, very expensive. It must be kept fed with glucose to keep it going. That tails off, and by about 15 years into adulthood, we use about 25% of our energy for the brain because we've got more active muscles and we've grown and so on. But it's still quite a high proportion. Now, what does this tell us about why babies might be fat? Here's a growth curve, or rather, sorry, energy consumption curve for a baby. And obviously, as the baby grows, the amount of energy it needs per day is increasing. But the red line shows pretty much the limit for the energy that can be provided by breast milk, nature's normal way of feeding. And after about 6 months, it's really not enough, and more energy has to be provided by complementary feeding, a process known as weaning. Babies need to go onto solid food at about 6 months. But that has problems, because whereas breast milk comes from a nice sterile container and is generally sterile, solid food probably isn't. There's a chance as you mix up the formula or what have you, or spoon in the stuff from the jar, that bacteria will get in, and babies get diarrhea, and anybody who's dealt with a 1-year-old or a baby between 6 months and 1 year old will know the unfortunate consequences of this. And an episode of diarrhea lasting 2 or 3 days because of a gastrointestinal infection is pretty serious in terms of the energy supply to the brain. And you can see that on the left-hand graph here, the frequency of episodes of diarrhea, and on the right, that's rather similar to the percentage of body fat. So the argument is that because energy requirements after about 6 months of age exceed the ability of breastfeeding to supply that energy, weaning onto solid foods carries the risk of gastrointestinal infection. And this is all nutritionally difficult for the baby. So the extreme fatness of babies provides a reserve, or so it's hypothesized, provides a reserve to get through those difficult periods of growth without interrupting the energy supply to the expensive brain. So just to recap what early human life looks like, we've got brain size at birth is very big, causes difficulty in birthing. Next one. We get rapid brain growth after birth. We get high fatness in infancy to provide a reserve for the expensive brain. And then fatness decreases in early childhood as the immune system grows, develops, and the baby's less likely to get GI infections. And these are components of the human life history. Now, life history is probably a term you've come across in studying biology. It just describes, as one well-known biologist put it, the various evolved strategies that species use to convert energy from their environment into copies of themselves. Imagine a tree. Its life history strategy is to photosynthesize using energy from the sun, produce lots of green leaves, produce seedlings, and produce lots of little trees. For mammals, the strategy is to eat things, whether they eat other animals, or eat plants, and produce offspring that way. So looking specifically at mammals, then it's all about choices. Do we grow small and have lots of kids and die quickly, like mice and rats? Or are we like elephants, where we grow slowly, have very few children, but really look after them and have a long life? Those are differences in the life history strategies of various mammals. What about human life history? Well, we have a very specific strategy. We have large brains, as we've been discussing. We have singleton pregnancies generally, just occasional twins and triplets. We have a long period of postnatal dependency. We have a long childhood that allows us to learn things. We have delayed sexual maturity, and that may resolve or avoid some of the conflicts in early life that are involved with looking for a mate. We have very few offspring, but most of them survive, at least these days. We have high parental investment. Most people look after their children very well. We have high intergenerational transfer, and that means that we can pass things on to our children. We can pass on knowledge about how we do things. We can pass on wealth, literally, or as houses or property and what have you. And we also live a long time. And I just wanted to focus on that high intergenerational transfer, because this allows one thing that humans pretty much uniquely among animals can do, and that's going for cultural evolution. over the last 5,000 years or so, humans have evolved from recording things on stone tablets to using computers, electronics. And that is a process called cultural evolution. Our culture evolves in the same way as our physiology, and in fact quite a lot quicker. Let's just compare biological and cultural evolution. In biological evolution, as you know, information is transmitted as genes. Natural and sexual selection come into play to decide which characteristics are transmitted to offspring, and the fitness measure is reproductive success. Whereas cultural evolution, information is transmitted as stories, books, films, music, artifacts. Societal preference selects which of those things are transmitted to the next generation. And the fitness measure is utility, whether it's a useful tool, or aesthetics, whether it's something beautiful that needs to be kept for the next generation. So again, looking at the features of human life history that facilitate that cultural evolution: large brains, long childhood period for learning, high parental investment, and again, the high intergenerational transfer. And to some extent, longevity, because of having long-lived parents and grandparents allows more information to pass to the offspring. And importantly, there's an interplay between cultural evolution and biological evolution. Things like the development of social groups, the development of technology, and the ability to utilize niche variation all impact on biological variation. And how's that work? Well, think about humans spreading across the planet. The ability to use shelter, fire, tools to colonize, say, Siberia was reflected on the biological evolution of the people who were able to live there. Compare the people who live in Siberia and the northern latitudes compared with the people who live in Central Africa. Very different physiology, and the effect of several thousand years of biological evolution driven by cultural evolution. So to sum up, humans have been very successful despite, or perhaps because of, this long period of childhood dependency that in many other species would be considered a point of vulnerability. And this has allowed humans to spread across the planet and live in these various niches, whether it's a river village in Thailand or a Eskimo igloo or the beautiful cities of Europe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Tatjana and Alan. Now what we're going to finish off with now is we're going to go back to Sir Peter, and he's going to look at how an understanding of human evolution helps us explain and learn more about the way we are today. So over to Sir Peter. Sir Peter.
Most of human medicine is focused on the how question. How does cancer arise? What are the changes in the genes in a cell that cause the cells to proliferate out of control? How does the mutation occur that starts that process off? How does a bacteria invade a cell? How does that invasion lead to responses which hurt the individual? But there's another dimension to medicine beyond the how question, and that's the why question. Why does something happen? Why is it that I'm wearing glasses? Why is it that other people, including myself, are relatively obese? Why is it that some people get very sick when they get infection and others don't get so sick? Why is it that new strains of virus emerge that threaten our population, such as the H1N1 virus? These questions, These why questions require a different form of thinking to the how questions, which are themselves the focus of molecular biology, physiology and biochemistry and pathology. the how questions require an understanding of evolutionary processes. And in the last 10 years, we've seen an enormous increase in the use of evolutionary understanding in addressing the how questions in medicine. And in a moment, I'm going to give you a couple of examples by way of introduction. One of the things that evolutionary understandings allow us to do is to integrate how one part of the body works with other parts of the bodies. Most of medical science focuses on individual attributes such as the renal system, such as how the retina works, etc., etc. But understanding how the body has developed as an integrated whole requires an understanding of how we've evolved. And as medicine has become more complex, this understanding of the holistic understanding of the human body becomes critical to working out strategies to make populations healthy. So why am I wearing glasses? Well, I'm wearing glasses because I'm short-sighted. Why am I short-sighted? Well, it's probably because I was brought up in an environment different to those my ancestors were brought up in. If one goes to a hunter-gatherer population, such as the Alaskan Inuit, one finds that before they were exposed to modern civilization or modern Western practices, the incidence of short-sightedness was very, very low. But once schooling and buildings with artificial light were introduced, the incidence of myopia rose to be almost 80 or 90% of the population. What has happened here? Well, humans evolved between 200 and 20,000 years ago, living in open environments where most of their interest was in things somewhat away from their immediate body, most of their visual interest, that is. And the eyeball grows as a child in relationship to the focal point of the light through your lens on your retina. Where you focus, the degree of focus of light on your retina controls the growth of the eyeball in its depth. If the eyeball grows, and therefore the eyeball evolved to grow focused on things you see somewhat further away from you than you would if you're reading. But if you grow up in an environment of artificial light and reading things as a child, you will focus on things much closer to you than your ancestors did 20,000 years ago. As a result of that, the rate of eyeball growth is different, the degree of eyeball growth is different, and you end up with a focal point for your eye which makes you easier for you to see things close to you than seeing things at a distance. That is short-sightedness. Now here's an example where a large part of the population, because they live in an environment different to that we lived in 20,000 years ago, now has a problem of myopia. This is a good example of the kind of mismatch which we understand by understanding evolutionary processes. In other words, we evolved our eyeball growth mechanism to be for an environment of living outdoors, and it's an inappropriate mechanism now we live largely indoors. And indeed, recent studies from Australia show that where children live outside and where they can able to fix on the horizon for 3 to 4 hours a day, they are much less likely to get myopia. Now, that's just one example of the many ways in which thinking about how we evolved explains why we get certain diseases or health problems. For example, appendicitis. Why do we get appendicitis? Well, we get appendicitis because we have an appendix, and the appendix is essentially a useless organ. We have it because an ancestral primate that lived between 20 and 40 million years ago lived off leaves and grasses. And to live off leaves and grasses, you have to have a very large gut. You have a large cecum, a large bowel, for the bacterial processes to digest the cellulose that's common to those food supplies. But as the primates evolved first into frugivores, that is to eat fruit, and then into omnivores, the dependence on grasses and leaves as a food source disappeared, and so the gut started to, there was no selection to maintain a large bowel and cecum. The appendix is just the rudimentary remnant of our pre-ancestral history of having a large bowel. And unfortunately, because it's now very small, for some people it's at risk of getting infected and infected and needs to be removed. There are very many mechanisms by which evolution can lead to disease. The other one that's well known, which you should think about, is the H1N1 virus. Here it's not that we're evolving, but that the organisms that we have to coexist with are evolving to outwit our defences. And so the H1N1 virus is an influenza virus which, because it replicates so quickly, can undergo evolution rapidly, whereas our defence mechanisms cannot evolve very rapidly because our generation time is 1 million times slower than that of bacteria, and therefore we're losing out in the arms race of coevolution with our viral partners. Other bacteria, on the other hand, we come into a good relationship with. So, for example, within our bowel we have very many bacteria, trillions of bacteria, who we have a commensal relationship with, and they play an important role in helping to supply some of the micronutrients, some of the vitamins that we depend upon. So you can see there's lots of ways in which we can think about evolution informing our understanding of health and disease, and in particular public health approaches to improving population health.
Okay, so what Professor Gluckman has just done there is given us some really good examples how, while learning about human evolution just to find out where we've come from is really fascinating, it's actually got a lot more serious consequences because it can help us to understand why we are what we are today. Now, last year's scholarship biology exam had a question on lactose intolerance, and that's a classic example of what Peter's been talking about. Something that happened in our past evolutionary history is still present in modern populations today. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the seminar. Now, it's been quite a long one compared to a lot of our other seminars, but that reflects what human evolution is like as a topic. Now, I'm just going to very quickly go through the challenge questions with you, and then we're going to get straight into the questions from the audience in the seminar chat. So the first question we're looking at is looking at why did bipedalism evolve? What was the adaptive advantage? The second question is looking at the adaptive advantage of the brain, but in this question you also have to bring in and look at the cost side of that adaptation. Now, the third challenge question is looking at how technology, in other words, what we call cultural evolution, has impacted on human evolution. But we're also asking you to go a step further and to consider the potential evolution of modern technologies on how humans might evolve in the future. Now, that's going to be quite a challenging question because you also need to go back and re-look at what evolution is and how natural selection works. And then the final challenge question, this is quite a big one, I'm not going to read it all out to you, but it's this idea of fitness. What exactly does fitness mean? And it's looking at this idea that selection is about adaptation and fitness for the environment, but we have traits and features in the human population that you might be expecting to lower fitness, but they still exist. Why is that? So a really good question to get you thinking. Okay, so at this point, we're going to throw open to the questions from both the live audience and from the seminar chat. Live audience people, you know the routine. If you've got a question, if you go to the microphone, then I'll come to you. But we'll start with a question from Anna and the seminar chat.
We have a question from Leon at Tamaki College. Was the fact that early humans lived in communities a driver for the increase in brain size, or was it the other way round?
Very, very good question, Leon. Which came first, chicken or the egg? In this case, the society or the brain size? Who's going to?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can. There's probably a loop going on there. What do you think,
I would say
Colleen?
it's a feedback loop
Yeah.
that drives it. I mean,
Yes.
chimpanzees have been living in communities for millions of years and have remained
Relatively uninvolved.
relatively
Yeah.
unencephalized. So I think it must have been a feedback loop as the community got bigger.
Okay.
Then the brain power necessary to deal with that community
Yeah.
became necessarily higher, and that just fed back.
Fed back. Yeah.
Okay. So not an easy question to answer, Leon.
question.
A good
Yeah.
question, well done. And one that, it's very hard to say exactly what comes first. Okay, Anna, another question from the seminar chat.
We've had lots of discussion on the Wiki chat around how religious groups, small communities and socio-economic groups would reproductively isolate people. What is the potential effect of this?
Well, you may have heard about the sort of in I don't know, even evolution and the concepts of bottleneck, and sort of which means that basically there is one, just by chance, a small group of people. So it can be a chance, or it can be something like a sort of religious community isolates itself, right, and then reproduce bits. So it means that within this group, the change of the gene structure, so the evolution can go in a particular direction. And one sort of example in human evolution is, for example, that the Bering Straits was really passed between Asia and America, was actually crossed by a relatively small, well, not relatively, but really small group of people. And these are the people who settled Americas. The evolution, and you can sort of see that both in terms of biological evolution, there are certain, just the outward features, certain kinds of genetic diseases that you will find there. And also in terms of cultural evolution, that it involved in a particular way that you can trace back to where they came from in Siberia, but there are also novel things. Or you can even think on terms of modern communities, say like Ashkenazi Jews, where there are particular Mendelian disorders that survived in this, and we can't really find them elsewhere in the, say, European communities where they came from, but in eastern states where they came as a very small group and intermarried, they still are there. So it has a very strong, and actually often because of the smallness of the group, quite sort of fast effect. I don't know if you want to add something.
The combination of a small founder population, just a few people contributing to the gene pool, and then possible intermarriage within that group can produce very spectacular effects. I think that the classic example is a very rare disease called fumarase deficiency, which there are probably about 20 cases known worldwide, and 15 of those are in a very small semi-religious community in the American Southwest. So it's a very inbred community, and that deficiency disease has spread very quickly within that community.
Great, thank you. So yes, communities that are isolated for whatever reason can have quite major effects on their gene pool and also on diseases.
That's a good example of how cultural and biological evolution feed back into each other. Because obviously then once you have the effect of cultural and biological, then there will be also effect of that biological, or say persistence of disease, back on the cultural evolution, right? Who is allowed to marry and things like that.
Yes, good, thank you. Okay, nobody from the live audience. Oh, okay, we have got one. Anna, we'll go to you and then we'll come to the live audience question.
We have a question from Ali R. from Harowhenua College. I think that the selection imposed on humans is now dependent on how wealthy people are, not by physical fitness. Would this be correct?
Good question. So is wealth acting as a selection pressure?
bit negative.
I would argue that the reverse is happening. If you look at the demographics of society over the last 100 years, as societies get richer, then the number of children in each family is falling. That seems to be a correlation across all sorts of social and religious groups. So in fact, it's almost the opposite happens, that an increase in economic wealth makes you more confident that the children you have are going to survive, and there's a driver there to have fewer children, of course, linked with the additional things like empowerment of women to use contraception and so on.
Okay. Yep. Do you want input?
No, I think that's what I would say.
Good question. Thank you, Ali. Right, to our live audience.
Hi, I'm Emily from Auckland Girls Grammar, and I'm curious about what happened to the Neanderthals, because I know that they had a larger brain size, and they were much more adapted to living in Europe than, of course, the humans, in terms of what we wear and stuff. So I'm curious what happened to them. What theory?
I think, Emily, you and a lot of scientists.
Depends whose novels you read. The answer is yes, they were adapted to living, or we think they were very well adapted to living in what was pretty much an Ice Age Europe. But things changed, the Ice Age ended. People with different abilities moved from Africa, from the Middle East, and it was just we don't know whether whether there's an assimilation or whether it was a violent ethnic cleansing, whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
I mean, that's something that we really don't know about. I mean, it's as Tatiana mentioned, there's a little bit of evidence that there's been some interbreeding, so-called introgression of Neanderthal genes into present humans, and that kind of indicates that whatever happened wasn't entirely violent, but really we don't know.
I'm also curious for one thing, because I heard on 60 Minutes last night, they said that we can have a human-robot hybrid in next, 30 or so years. And I mean, I was thinking, isn't there like after effects in terms of, radiation to our brain, and in terms of injecting something really machine into our bodies?
Well,
What do they mean by human-robot hybrid?
They were saying something like a mechanism that can actually turn back the biological clock and make you turn young and be immortal, apparently.
tell me more. I mean, when they talk about a human robot hybrid, I would have assumed they meant something like a highly developed artificial limb, or, I mean, technology is pushing out human capabilities. We can travel to the far side of the world in 24 hours, which nobody could have envisaged 1,000 years ago. And so technology is always pushing that ability, and we have this sort of technological society that is evolving with us. The technology is evolving along with our bodies, but in terms of being able to push back the frontiers of aging, well, that's science fiction. But the old, what scientists say is, if a scientist says something is science fiction, then it's likely to happen in the next few years.
Right, thank you for that, Emily. Anna, another question from the seminar chat, please.
We have a question from Leon from Tamaki College. With more mental ability, we don't have to be physical because you're able to use tools more effectively. Is this the pattern seen in human evolution?
All right, so I think what Leon's sort of saying there is, are we seeing a decline in physical ability because the brain is becoming the dominant feature?
That would first presuppose that we really know what the physical ability was. What we can see in human evolution, certainly, that prior to Neolithic, the humans were quite sort of a lot taller, and that possibly we are just coming back in the last 100 years to the size and the height that human hunter-gatherers had before 10,000 years ago. So that's sort of in terms of, height. But I don't know about other kind of sort of potential parameters that would measure the physical capacity. It's something that it's really, difficult to sort of know.
Yes, again,
Yeah.
it's this
Sort of-
technological, physical, or physiological coevolution. We don't need to use physical power to do things like farming or mining or
Yeah.
what have you, because we have machines to do it. But people then have the leisure to do physical training, to engage in sports and so on, which provides that impetus to keep fit and maintain the body. So
So I
it's
think probably there is no evidence for that. I would say, for that kind of, at least for now, because also you have to sort of think that this fast development of technology in terms of human evolution, that's not a very long period.
That last point from Tatjana is actually a very important one. We've got to remember that evolution is something that does take place over very long periods of time. And the evolution of us as modern Homo sapiens is a relatively recent event in that evolutionary history. Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on time at the moment because I do want to finish with announcing the major seminar awards. So we've got time for 2 more questions. If there's anybody else from the live audience, I'll make you one of them. Otherwise, we'll go to 2 from the seminar chat. So we'll start with Anna first.
This is a question from the wiki chat. I thought that Neanderthals had larger brains, but maybe not in the important areas like the neocortex. How does this relate to what you were saying earlier?
We don't have, of course, soft tissue evidence, but we have. They've certainly had large brains, but there's the fact of the matter is, we said it's really hard to know why they disappeared. So and it's having large brain or about the same sort of size doesn't necessarily mean that they had other kinds of features that would help them in the, say if there was a kind of a Paleolithic war or genocide or something like that. It's sort of it's it's based. It's sort of the what we have is sort of based. It's all based on skeletal evidence. So you can sort of estimate on the basis of the skull size, but I don't know if you have.
Yes, we can take absolute brain size from just doing skull casts, but to actually measure the neocortex ratio, which is soft tissue and is long gone, is rather more is much more difficult and in fact impossible.
Okay. So it may be that why the Neanderthal does have a large brain. The million-dollar question is which parts of the brain were large, and were they in those key areas that contributed to the success of Homo sapiens? And that may be a question that we'll never know the answer to. Okay, last question is going to come from the live studio audience. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name's Jordan from the Correspondence School, and I was wondering, do you think that artificial evolution will now be the primary way in which we evolve? Will our own ability with technology, our own brain size, etc., mean that we can actually enhance our evolution faster than would naturally be possible?
Nice question.
You can't, we are doing things, our social conditions now are doing things that one might argue could cause faster evolution. One simple example is that women are delaying having their children till the age of about 30 now. I think it's about the mean age for first birth in New Zealand is about 30 years. And because of the availability of technology, contraception, what have you, biologically, women who delay pregnancies, delay their first birth, can have difficulty conceiving. So there are two potential consequences from that. First of all is that there may be selection for women who can have children later, that process. And second, for couples who go for assisted reproduction because of that difficulty in conceiving. Then we've seen a report from the Liggins today that said children conceived by a particular form of IVF are actually taller than the naturally conceived children. So there's a quite a marked physiological change there of this particular form of IVF. So that's evolution in action. The technological change is causing a difference in the phenotype. Now, you can speculate, and it goes into the realms of science fiction again as to how quickly that can accelerate.
Thank you. And that's actually what one of those challenge questions is asking you to do, is to think about the technologies and what impact they may have on the future evolution of humans. Okay, so at this point, we'll stop the questions. I'm aware that there probably are still some from the seminar chat, but what I'll do is get Tatjana and Alan to answer those, and we'll post them up on the wiki. So you two can sit down. So what we're going to do now is have a look at the 4 big awards for the seminar series. Now, you'll be aware that back at the beginning of the year, we told you about these seminar series awards, and part of them have been the regular awards every seminar for the best question and also the best contribution to the wiki discussion. But we do have these 4 big ones, and it's been quite difficult choosing because there's been so many great contributions from schools, from teachers and students, that the next update that I'm going to send out is actually going to have the special mentions of the people we couldn't give an award to, but who I felt deserved acknowledgement. So our first award is going to be for the best participation by a school. Now, what we were looking at there is participation in all aspects of the seminar, through watching the seminar, contributing to the wiki, asking questions, that type of thing. And there have been a lot of schools involved. In fact, as of last week, we had another registration. We've had over 103 schools in the seminar series this year. So it was difficult to make the choice, but it has gone to Riccarton High School in Christchurch. So congratulations to the students and the teachers of Riccarton High School for your contribution, particularly their consistent contribution to answering the Wiki Challenge questions. Now, the next seminar award is for best participation by a student. This one was particularly hard to choose, and again we were looking for that contribution not just to one aspect, because we have had some outstanding contributions from certain students in questions and in wiki answers, but that overall contribution to the wiki, to the questions, and also being involved in the seminars. And the award, I'm really pleased to say, is the student is actually in the audience with us today, and it's going to Himanshu from Dilworth School, so well done. Now, Himanshu's actually going to get, his prize is going to be a couple of days with various NRCGD centres around the country, finding out about what NRCGD does and some of the things happening at those universities. So we're going to be contacting him to talk to him and put that particular program together. Now, the next award, the Seminar Chat Award, and as those of you who have never experienced the chat, it's actually been an amazing thing to be part of. I have the ability to read the chat the following day, but I can also see when the seminars are on, people down the back of the room and the smiles and the fingers going, so I'm aware that things are very busy. So what we were looking for here was the student who has been consistently on the chat, but not just asking questions, also taking part in discussions and building that community of knowledge with the other students on the chat. And that student is Alex from Onehunga High School, so well done to Alex. He's been a very active contributor, and also the day his school came into the live audience, he was one of the people who stood up and asked a question in the live audience. And there are going to be book tokens going to Alex to help with buying textbooks for his studies next year. And then finally, Best Supporting Teacher. This was actually a lot of fun for me because I asked you to nominate the teachers for me. And it's been a real pleasure reading what you, the students, have had to say about your teachers. And there were any number of teachers that I could have given this award to. It was very difficult to make the choice. But in the end, what came through from the nominations from this teacher's students was her commitment to them, and in terms of really encouraging, supporting, pushing her students to have a go at the challenge questions, posting them on the wiki, and just generally that all-round going the extra mile. So well done to Liz Lewis from Horowhenua College. So on that note, a very big thank you to everybody. I'd also like to thank the student ambassadors that have been with us all year. Those of you who've been on the chat will know these names: Campbell, Nick, and my brain's just gone blank, Josephine, Mirinal, and have I got them all? I think I have. They have been part of the chat, just keeping the chat going. And also a big thank you to you, the teachers, and you, the students. Good luck for your exams, and all the best for the future. Thank you.